Hello, everybody. I greet the fellow educators and wishing a good conversation for all of us. I'm going to read the text. I am Thales, a visual artist. I practice capoeira Angola, and I am a disciple of Master João Angoleiro. I am also a professor at IFMG, Federal Institute of Minas Gerais, in southeast of Brazil, the most urbanized and industrialized region of my country. My state is called Minas Gerais, meaning mines everywhere. It was here that the gold rush took place in 17th century, which enriched Portugal and later England. Today is one of the territories most harassed by the mining of gold, iron, zinc, etc. It's also the territory of several indigenous peoples, as the Aranã, Cachixó, Krenak, Machacali, Pataxó, Pancararu, Xakriabá, Chucuru, Cariri. I speak to you from this place, hoping to contribute to the construction of a new collective reality closer to Gaia, the great living being that carries us on her back through the outer space. I come to talk to you about dialogues established with teachers and artists from some indigenous peoples in my region, such as the Pataxó and Xakriabá. These discussions revolve around the decolonization of our schools and ways of teaching and learning. My hypothesis is that the colonial project of civilization brought by Europeans to Brazil and its people is based on the monoculture enterprise, which includes the elimination of biological and epistemic diversities. The first Brazilian universities originated from French missions, and for a long time they were a copy of the European university in a simplified version. Just as the monoculture eliminates the biodiverse forests for the implantation of large plantations of a single species, the monoepistemic university celebrates and disseminates only a single regime of knowledge, despising the others for considering them inferior. To overcome the climate, moral, and civilizing crisis that we are experiencing, we need to subvert this logic of monoculture in favor of a biological, cultural, epistemological, educational, and cosmological diversity in the world. Brazil is known worldwide for the great biodiversity of its forests and savannas, which still resists the domestication of the monoculture enterprise. There is also great diversity among indigenous peoples. 305 ethnic groups and over 274 languages spoken. Today, scientists have proven that indigenous peoples are the greatest guardians of the planet's biodiversity. They know that we don't know how to get out of the trap that our predatory way of living has created for us ourselves, the hecatombs arising from climate change. Now, we need to acknowledge the neglected science and turn to the intellectuals who have been silenced for centuries, the elders of the various indigenous peoples. The Pataxó and Xakriabá are peoples from the northeast and southeast of Brazil, the first regions of the country invaded by the Portuguese colonial project. For approximately 500 years, they had their science revoked, their language forbidden, and their lands invaded. For centuries, they have developed strategies of epistemological resistance. They have sophisticated techniques of keeping forbidden chants in the heart, protecting their language while they were banned, carrying on rituals whose spiritual leaders had been killed and ambushed, etc. They are what I call operations of nature of roots, the underground work of living culture that remains dormant inside families and villages, far from the spotlight or the lanterns of the persecutors. The lava that heated the ground beneath these people's villages surfaced at the end of 20th century, annexed after the Federal Constitution of Rights of 1988. It was the phenomenon of the retomada da cultura, or repossession of culture, that comes from the idea of repossession of lands that had been invaded by farmers decades or centuries ago. It's taking back, take possession, and what was rightfully theirs. The repossession of culture, as Nitinawan Pataxó says, is like a dormant volcano that exploded, set fire to the outside, throwing sparks to all the villages. Thus, the knowledge that was kept was encouraged to circulate. Chants that weren't sung for a long time were sung again. New chants were created. Old practices that were forgotten began to be resumed. The language that was forbidden started to be recovered from fragments brought by the elders, by anthropological records, and by other indigenous peoples of common origin. The retaken language started to be taught to the children of all indigenous schools of all the villages. The stories of the people were told again, filling the empty gap in textbooks and the history written by the colonizers. A very important actor in this process was the indigenous school, which was tamed by a collective movement of indigenous teachers and local education agents. Its calendar and its structure were modified in favor of a movement to indigenize school process. As Xakriabá wrote, the idea was to value the culture, the way of life, the history of struggle, the management of the territory, and research with the elderly, in addition to working on all the disciplines that are required in the curriculum. In the past, Xakriabá youth were formed by the school to adjust to life in the cities and to the division of labor. They ended their school trajectory and spent months away from their families working coffee and sugarcane monoculture plantations. Now, the restructured indigenous school fosters the connection between young people, the elders, and the network of relationships that sustain the territory. It enables them to cultivate crops, to practice extractivism, to do arts and handcrafts of their peoples, to think ecologically, the ethnotourism. With the intercultural approach, the indigenous schools articulate academic and with native research methodologies. It as if it created agroecological corridors in the large field of monoculture on the school soil. But how can the monoepistemic school of the big cities learn from the Pataxó and Xakriabá schools in search for epistemological diversity? One of the great moves of the indigenous school is to make room in the school routine for traditional native learning practice. In 2018, during my fieldwork carried out at the school of Coroa Vermelha indigenous land of Pataxó people, I witnessed the visit of the master and artist Mr. José Sena Pataxó in the classes of Arizana Pataxó. He came to teach students how to weave tissumi, a traditional technique. The presence of Mr. José Sena Pataxó installed another teaching-learning environment in the room. He didn't give any class. He didn't teach anything. While he was telling stories or answering students' questions, he was branding tissue. The young people listened and intensely observed the movements of his hands, the knife, and the fiber of the chandor. After a long time, the master decided that it was time for the students to try to do it themselves. He gave them the splint with the fiber, which passed from hand to hand. At the moment, conventional school methodologies were suspended to make room for native traditional methodology. The intensive observation of the master by the apprentice in the midst of everyday conversation and activities is how the Pataxó learned traditional words for their people. This episode connected with what the Aboriginal teacher of the Araucan people in Australia, Tyson Yunca Porta, told me in an interview. The teacher doesn't have to be an expert in Aboriginal culture, indigenous culture. The teacher shouldn't teach then the culture, but just make room for the culture and make room for the perspective and the politics and their own story and their own story. Thus, in 2019, in the light of the practice of Arizana Pataxó, it's Tyson, in the light of the practice of Arizana Pataxó, I made room for the stories and the cultures of my students. I invited the elders, their grandmothers, to a conversation table about knowledge that passed from generation to generation. It was a way of experimenting with Pataxó process in the classroom, that is, planting Pataxó process in the soil of the monoepistemic school. After the conversation, our students interviewed their grandmothers in search of personal stories of their family stories or their family stories. These are stories that books do not tell, but only circulate orally. Stories that constitute the lives of these students and that were often unknown. Then we made comics from these stories, and finally, we built a single collective story, which won a film script and was recorded by the students. Rather than appreciating photos in indigenous headdresses in showcased in museums, the production of a video inspired by ancestral stories can be much more productive for understanding and approaching indigenous universes. The headdresses were not made to be used as paintings, but non-indigenous teachers and curators insist on forcing the adjustment of indigenous arts to the artistic standards of European tradition. This is what I call epistemological oppression. Thus, making room for a culture is very different from working with indigenous content with the same conventional school methodologies, which were developed for European cultural products. Working with stories transmitted orally by grandmothers means being inspired by the Pataxó idea of the elderly as holders of knowledge or PhDs in their cultural domains. It is to activate flows of oral knowledge secularly neglected. It is to dialogue with surviving indigenous practice that still remain in our daily lives. It's working, it's working with the social and cultural diversity that occupies the margins of our communities and that are abundant in perspectives, ways of thinking the world, relating to nature, producing affections, expressing, imagining life, building reality. Margins that have not yet been domesticated by the monoculture and monoepistemic enterprise, and that are indomitable in their diversity, in their cultural richness. Thank you for your attention. Here is my mail. We can change more in other moments.